Welcome, everyone. We are continuing with the next Shiur in our series on Franz Rosenzweig and the return to Judaism. This topic is an interesting one. It's about why, for Franz Rosenzweig, the Baal Teshuvah, the one who returns to Judaism, cannot be Reform or Orthodox. And what is the path that the one who returns to Judaism has to walk in order to get there? Now, as I've said to you before, part of why I'm so deeply attracted to Franz Rosenzweig as a thinker, as a religious thinker, is because he plots a path that is very different from the majority of which Jews in the 20th century have plotted for themselves. Most of the Jewish reaction to trying to figure out what it means to be a Jew in the last century or two often fits into some very clear ideological boxes. And Franz Rosenzweig, to his incredible genius, somehow is able to grasp, I would say in many ways, the essence of Judaism and Yiddishkeit, while at the same time recognizing that if it's going to express itself, Judaism, and this fundamentally new and different, radical modern era, it's going to have to be the same, but also different all at the same time. Something that very hard for, I would say, modern Jewish ideologies to always grasp, because they each have their own interests in ways that often only allow them to see part of Judaism, but not the whole. And we know this from our own experience, right? Different Jews of different denominations oftentimes see part of what makes Judaism, but not the whole. And Rosenzweig is trying to plot a path that enables us to keep all of those different pieces within our line of sight and our vision. So last week we were still focusing on the unique moment in Franz Rosenzweig's life when he decides to remain Jewish, when he came right up to the precipice of converting to Christianity, but instead had a realization that when you strip it all away, he's still a Jew and he wants to remain a Jew. And what comes out of that moment in his life is also the realization that if he's going to remain a Jew, it can't just be a Jew by default. It has to be a Jewishness which provides his life with a fundamental meaning and orientation, a Jewishness that he's going to have to be willing to stake his life on, to commit to fully. And that means it can't be a Jewishness that's like the Reform assimilated Jewishness that he grew up with. It has to be much, much more than that, though he even says at the time that he recognizes that his new awareness is very much a beginning, and it's a beginning that he's not quite sure where it's going to take him. Well, one of the things that I do appreciate about Rosenzweig as well is that he has this awareness that his life needs to be different and that he needs to commit to his Judaism fully, but he's willing to be patient to figure out what that's going to look like. Oftentimes, when we come to the realization that everything in our life needs to change, we want to jump right into what's going to come next. We want to imagine that there's already a fully depicted future right there that we can just dive right into and take on all these things and become it, especially with returning to Judaism, right? People, Baal Teshuvah, love to dive headfirst into Torah and mitzvah. They just want to like take it all on. And this is the specific vision of what it's supposed to be. And Rosenzweig is patient, in part because I think that's his nature, but also in part because he recognizes, and we'll come back to this, that there is no fundamental definition to what it means to be Jewish. There's always something somewhat open-ended about that. And that means the process of the return to Judaism has to, in some way, be open-ended, right? As firm as you want to be, as Orthodox as one wants to be, right? That never fully captures the totality of what it means to be Jewish. And to present that to a Baal Teshuvah, okay, here's the 613 mitzvot, just do all these, and now you can be a full Jew, right? Is in some ways misleading, and we'll try to tease out exactly how that might be, what that might mean. So we'll look at these letters from Rosenzweig in just a moment, but I'll just pick up a little bit of Rosenzweig's bio and then how it takes us to where these letters are. Rosenzweig's collapse and his newfound awareness about his Judaism occurs in 1913. And at that point, he's finished his academic learning and he decides he's going to remain a Jew, but he doesn't know quite what that means. He's in his early mid-20s. He's not yet married. He's not really quite sure what kind of future he has as somebody who's going to remain a Jew in Germany, where academic doors are primarily closed to him. But he does recognize, even from 1913, that he's got to learn more about what it means to be Jewish. So later that year, he goes to Berlin and he studies with the great Jewish German philosopher, Hermann Cohen. And Cohen was one of the only Jews in Germany to actually have an official professorship, right, who's sort of the exception. And Cohen is probably the most well-known Jew in Germany. He's not so much a Jewish philosopher, like that he's famous for being a Jewish philosopher. He's famous for being a philosopher. He develops a particular way of thinking about Kant, Immanuel Kant, that becomes very significant in Germany. And he's a very important person because as an intellectual, as a philosopher, but Cohen, towards the end of his own life, actually makes a bit of a turn towards Judaism and towards the tradition. He's sort of associated with Reform, Cohen, but he was not a Reform thinker because he really came from academia, like his own intellectual academic world. And he was sort of claimed by Reform, but it wasn't like he spent his whole life as a Reform thinker. He was an intellectual academic who turned towards Judaism later in his life. And Cohen was profoundly learned and profoundly brilliant. And Rosenzweig, studying with Cohen was very, very significant for Rosenzweig. The two developed a relatively close relationship. And Cohen was just very impactful on Rosenzweig's own Jewish journey. 1914, World War I breaks out, and Rosenzweig volunteers to serve in the Red Cross. And he spends the next 3 years in the war, right? Seeing some limited action, being stationed farther into Eastern Europe. And what's really important about his time during the war is that it's his first encounter as he leaves Germany, and he goes with the German forces into Eastern Europe with the Red Cross. He meets Eastern European Jews, Hasidic Jews, Sephardi Jews, and Eastern European Jews are very, very different than German Jews because Eastern European Jews are, like, for lack of a better expression, like frum and traditional in ways that German Jews are not. And German Jews sort of feel like they've lost the tradition and they're kind of aware of it. And some of them are happy that they're moving into a new modern world, and some of them are sort of lamenting it. But they look at these Eastern European Jews as having something that they themselves have lost. Or you can think about it for a moment, like in America, like with Fiddler on the Roof, right? American assimilated Jews turned to the image of the Chassid in Fiddler on the Roof and saw some sort of authentic Jewishness that they themselves have lost. So a similar thing was what happened in Germany, where Germany would look towards Eastern European Jews in that way. But at the same time, a lot of German Jews just look down on Eastern European Jews. They look down on the Orthodox as being backwards, primitive, right? These backward, primitive Eastern European Jews, they're poor, they don't know anything, right? They're not modern, right? There was a lot of paternalism there as well. Even in America, if you don't know this, German Jews who came to America also had a lot of paternalism towards Eastern European Jews who immigrated later. German Jews came much earlier. They were like the first Jews in America. Eastern European Jews came at the late 19th, early 20th century. And as was pointed out for me, I know Naomi's from New York, or her family is from New York. It's a strange thing that the east side of Manhattan has two Jewish hospitals, one on the lower, like Midtown Lower East Side, and one on the Upper East Side. It's like, why did that happen? Well, I was told that basically the rich German Jews built a hospital for the middle/lower East Side so that their Eastern European cousins wouldn't have to come to the Upper East Side to their hospital. That was the way it was told to me. German Jews towards Eastern European Jews continued even beyond Europe. But Rosenzweig, when he encounters them, realizes that he's experiencing something that he himself did not have access to when he was young, and that's very powerful for him. And for some of you, if you've been on your own Jewish journey where you became more religious, I imagine some of your first really significant encounters with, like, Orthodox Jews were very meaningful, because there's a sense in which they're living sort of a different life, attuned to a different wavelength than everybody else around them. And that experience, I think, was very, very, very powerful for Rosenzweig. The first letter we'll look at is a letter he writes to his parents about his experiences meeting a Jewish child. And I wrote the date here. It's April 13, 2017. It's not. It's I must have put it in wrong. And here's how he describes this encounter he has with this is a Sephardi Jew, I think, in Bulgaria. And Rosenzweig describes it as follows. He has a couple of letters. He's very impressed with the Sephardi community there and how different it is from the German community, and what he's taking away from this experience of encountering them. He says in his encounter with the child, he says, already before then, he asked me, the child, when it became apparent to him that I was an only child, why didn't your father pay, as was the custom among the Bulgarians, a ransom to get me out of conscription? Right? In his conversation with the young Jewish child, the child asks him, wait a second, why are you serving in the German army? Right? Our custom is that your family will pay to get you out of the army. So the reason I think that's significant from the get-go is that, right, before emancipation, right, Jews did not see themselves as citizens of the country in which they lived, right? They were sort of like permanent guests on a certain, in a sense, right? So if there was a draft, right, Jews didn't necessarily see themselves as being responsible or connected to that country, right? Like, so they would pay to get out of it, right? We're Jews, we're going to do our own thing. Rosenzweig, however, comes from Germany, where there's been emancipation, and more importantly, Jews see themselves as German citizens, right? Germany is very important to them. And so it would be natural for a German Jew to want to could be conscripted into the army. That's called patriotism, right? You want to support your country. So right away, you see a major distinction here. Eastern European Jews don't want to be in the army, don't want to be in the draft. They don't have that sense of patriotism for their country because they're not citizens, they're separate. Whereas German Jews, right, they're going to go into the army, they have a role to play. So right from the get-go, there's a big difference. But Rosenzweig goes on, or the boy basically goes on and says to Rosenzweig, if you have to serve in the army, he said, then God should protect you and nothing bad should happen to you. Basically, the young boy offers him a bracha, which is, I just think, meaningful to Rosenzweig. He suddenly said with emotion, the child, to Rosenzweig, that he once saw a man whose father had given him 2 pages from the book of Psalms, that they should protect him. Had my father given me something similar? No, Rosenzweig responds, and the child asks, why not, with great concern. There are those who do this amongst us, but others not. If something was to happen to me, it would be according to the will of God. So what the boy says to Rosenzweig is basically, why don't you carry around like pages from Sefer Tehillim with you, right? Because clearly in that community, right, they would use things like pages from Sefer Tehillim as almost like a magical charm to ward off danger, right? You might have seen this. This is still somewhat true in Sephardi communities today, right? There was an emphasis on amulets. People would wear or make amulets that would conceived of being magical and could protect people. But you'll see it today with like in cabs. Like you'll see cabs with Sephardi drivers that have like mezuzahs in them. Cabs don't need mezuzahs, but it's considered like a good luck charm. So the boy is asking, like, why don't you do this kind of thing? Like, this is like a natural thing to do. Like, they'll help you, they'll protect you. And Rosenzweig basically says he doesn't do that. That's not what they do where he comes from. But clearly he's still moved by the boy's superstition, but ultimately naive religious faith that Rosenzweig finds very meaningful. And Rosenzweig goes on to tell his parents, he says, I almost burst forth crying out from this mixture of formality and childhood innocence. If we were in the street, I would have hugged the head of this young representative of the people with both of my hands. This is the first child who spoke to me in this way. In general, I had only heard these things from the elderly. So what Rosenzweig is saying, he's so moved by this conversation with this young Jewish child, again, for a variety of reasons. First off, the young child is showing this great love and concern from Rosenzweig, his fellow Jew. So I think that sense of solidarity that the child feels for Rosenzweig, even though they don't know each other and they come from such different worlds, is very significant, right? That again, the Jews feel a love and connection with other Jews wherever they are and wherever they be. That's like the most traditional Jewish thing there could be. And to see that from a child is very powerful for Rosenzweig. And Rosenzweig feels a real connection to the child and wants to embrace him, to show his own love and affection for it. And what's particularly important to Rosenzweig is that this authentic religious attitude that the boy has is not coming from an elderly Jew, but a child. And I think this is significant because on a certain level, even today, we expect the elderly Jews, those from previous generations, to be enmeshed within the tradition. They're the ones who are going to hold on to sort of naive religious faith, right? Like the older generation. Because the younger generation is already being educated into a new modern world, one in which religious faith is neither natural nor obvious. So to see this kind of piety coming from a child is a sign that something is alive and vibrant, right? That this religious faith has a vitality to it and a future because it's coming from a child, right? If it was only coming from the elderly, you kind of feel it's like a relic of the past and you sort of hold on to it nostalgically, but it doesn't seem like it has a future. And I mean, look, I think I grew up with this in my generation, right? There were our Saba and Softer, Bubby and Zaidi had a certain like Jewishness, authenticity that was somehow lacking from later generations, right? Whether it was like superstitions, my Bubby had certain superstitions, or just the way they related to certain mitzvot or Jewish ideas of the Seder or whatever, that was like deep and meaningful and natural and authentic. But like by the time you get a generation or two later, it's as if that kind of authenticity is gone. And so for Rosenzweig to see it within a child, again, is a sign that this kind of natural religious faith isn't something that should be left to a dead world of the past, but rather it indicates a living Jewish world where Jewish identity is, again, natural, and that Jewish life doesn't require any kind of special rationalization or justification. It just is, because that's who you are. So that's just one significant encounter he has, where, again, Judaism is natural and normal through the eyes of a child and just enmeshed within this tradition. And in another letter, he uses this very powerful metaphor to describe the difference between Jewish life in Germany and Jewish life in Eastern Europe. And what's so significant about this is what he's trying to get at. And he uses the metaphor of Queen Victoria of England and Queen Eugenia of Spain. Queen Eugenia is Queen Victoria's granddaughter, and how Queen Eugenia of Spain represents the German Jew, and Queen Victoria of England represents the Eastern European Jew. Queen Eugenia is the granddaughter, is like, again, the modern German Jewish identity, whereas Queen Victoria, who's the Eastern European Jew, is the one who's still very much enmeshed in tradition. And Rosenzweig compares how the two might act similar, but like also different from each other. And here's how he describes it. I don't think this is based on any that captures the shift of Judaism before modernity to the modern Jewish experience. So he gives the following example. Queen Eugenia of Spain was visiting Queen Victoria, and the two of them went to the theater for a show. And they entered into the royal box, right? If you've ever seen, big theater, I think the Cleveland, I can't remember what it's called now, orchestra, the Philharmonic, Cleveland Philharmonic, right? You go into Severance Hall, right? There are like special boxes, and if you're royalty, obviously, there's a very, very special box that's, designated for you. And what's significant is that royal box is in view of the whole audience. So when Queen Eugenia and Victoria walk into the box, what Rosenzweig says they would do is they would approach the railing of the box and bow to the audience, right? They're sort of making their presence known in this grand entrance, bowing to the audience as part of this formality of being in the theater together, in this particular almost ritualistic experience, right? Much of like nobility, royalty is that life revolves around these very like ritualistic experiences, right? To be a royal in England is basically like live a life of your own halacha. Like you have all these norms and rules that like guide everything you do. So what happens though, what's unique is the difference between the way Victoria and Eugenia sit down after doing this. What Rosenzweig says what would happen, at least in theory, is that Victoria, without looking behind her, would sit down. But Eugenia, however, would sit down only after she was convinced by a quick glance that the chair which she was about to sit on was indeed in its place. So just to capture the metaphor fully here, the two walk into the box. They bow to the audience. Victoria immediately sits down, right? She's facing the audience and she just sits down because she knows there's a chair behind her. She doesn't even need to look because she's the queen, and there's just like a way things are done. And the way things are done as part of this ritual means that she bows and then she sits down, and she knows there's going to be a chair there, meaning one of the servants has put the chair underneath her, right? So she doesn't have to look for it, right? It's just she's got this regal, self-possessed attitude towards all of this. Eugenia, her granddaughter, however, like can't just do this so naively. Like she does the same sort of ritualistic entering and bowing down, but she's got to quickly look to see if there's a chair there before she sits down. And this captures the distinction, again, between the German Jew, who's got to look down to see if there's a chair there before they are Jewish, whereas the Eastern European Jew doesn't need to look because their Judaism is just fundamentally inherent and authentic to who they are. And this is how Rosenzweig describes it. He says, underneath the back of the Eastern European Jew stands the chair, and he sits on it without looking backwards. Eastern European Jew doesn't have to question their Jewishness. They don't have to justify their Jewishness. It's who they are. That's why they can sit down without having to think about it. He is more innocent in his spirituality than the spiritually lacking Western Jew who lives life as a tennis game, etc. Right? For the German Jew, Judaism is like a bit of a game that you kind of play here and there, but it's not like a natural part of your existence. It's like the thing you do. Like people go play tennis for a couple hours a week with their friends, right? It's got its own rules, its own place that you do it, right? Like that's the way Judaism is for the German Jew. It doesn't really touch their fullness of who they are. It's limited and it has its own little rules, and that's it. The Western Jew always looks backwards. If indeed there is a chair before he will have the audacity to sit. Right? A German Jew has to like be fully convinced that whatever they're going to do that's Jewish is like reasonable and rational and justifiable. Because if not, like we're not going to do this. We gotta to move on. So what Rosenzweig is arguing here is that to live a life fully within tradition is to live in a world where Judaism has a taken for grantedness. That's Queen Victoria. That's the child that he encounters in Bulgaria. One lives a Jewish life not because it's historically provable or because it's highly ethical, right? We don't want to come up with all these reasons why we're doing it. One lives a Jewish life simply because one is a Jew. One lacks a sense of reflexivity, the need to look at one's actions and reflect on why one does or doesn't do things. Jewish practice for the traditional Jew, for Queen Victoria, for the child, is basically one's mother tongue. You learn it from your parents and your community, you absorb it, it becomes the natural rhythms of your way of life, and you don't question it. And Jewish life has a certain integrity and innocence because of this. You know what the expectations are of you, and you know that your life is going to look quite similar to the life of your parents and your grandparents, right? Tradition has this taken for grantedness. Tradition sort of sets the bounds and guidelines for who you are and what you do, and you don't question it for the most part. The German Jew is the alternative, right? And the modern Jewish experience, the one that we're all familiar with. They live very differently. By entering into the modern world, the German Jew confronts options and choices never experienced by the European Jew, right? German Jew is emancipated. The Eastern European Jew is not. With the choice not to be Jewish, because German Jews have that choice, comes the reality that one must then reflect on why be Jewish, why have a Jewish life. The moment you get to choose not to be Jewish is the moment you got to come up with the reasons why to remain Jewish. So you got to reflect on it. Every aspect of what it means to be a Jew has to have justification, and things that don't make sense, you just get rid of. It's not sufficient just to do something because it's the way it's always been done. There have to be reasons that can be explained, reasons that can help Jews make sense of why they do what they do, and perhaps reasons that Jews can convey to non-Jews to explain to them why they're doing what they do. Without justification, without the ability to justify one's Jewishness, it's as if there's no chair underneath oneself, and that's why you're going to be afraid to sit down. And therefore, the German Jew is constantly checking to make sure that this makes sense to still be a Jew, and that there's, as I said, reason and justification for it. In the German Jewish frame, like Jewish life is much more fraught because it's under constant scrutiny. And if the chair is not there, one can't sit down. And this is true. Look, this is true for even modern Orthodoxy today, right? Modern Orthodoxy struggles exactly with those aspects of Jewishness that don't really seem justifiable, either because perhaps we view them as immoral, or perhaps that we view them as simply not historically, accurate in some way, right? Why should we hold on to these things, right? Even modern Orthodoxy looks for the chair to be able to make sense of its Jewishness. So the challenge that Rosenzweig is facing here is it possible for a German Jew, for a modern Jew, to go back and have this experience like the Jewish child that he meets, or to return to Queen Victoria, right? Where Jewishness can be just taken for granted, where one can sit down in one's Jewishness and not have to ask, is there a chair underneath? And this is a very difficult question because it's not clear whether you can go back to this, right? There's a famous Thomas Wolfe, I believe that's his name, great American novelist. So his most significant work is You Can't Go Home Again, which is a early 20th century novel. And it basically depicts the fundamental rupture of modern life, not even just for Jews, but for Americans, right? There's a fundamental rupture of a modern life that just, the way things were aren't the way they can be anymore. And there's this sense in modernity that you can't go home again. You don't get to go back to what Jewish life was like in the shtetl. Queen Eugenia can't ever live life like her grandmother, Queen Victoria, does, right? There's just a break, a rupture, and everything's different going forward. That's at least one way to look at it. And if that's the case, then the question becomes what is there to say about Jewishness? How does Jewishness retain its authenticity in a world where there's been this dramatic transformation. That's where we're going to pick up going forward right now, is how Rosenzweig conceives of the possibility of a return to the tradition. Seems like almost like an impossible one. And what's fascinating is that if you look at the depiction of Jewishness in the Star of Redemption, Rosenzweig's very important philosophical work, there's a whole major section of it depicted to what Jewish life looks like. And when you read that section, what you see is a depiction of Jewish life that's pretty frum, pretty religious, that sees halacha and Torah and mitzvot as the center point of Jewish life. So when Rosenzweig finishes the Star of Redemption, and that's what he's depicted Jewish life to be like, he's left again with this profoundly pressing question: is this possible for him? How can he return to that? And he's really been dedicating these last few years of his life, and really the last part of his life, to thinking through how that can ultimately be possible. Now, what he realizes, or what the conclusion that he comes to as this question of the return to Judaism, to the Jewish tradition, is that the Jewishness he is striving to return to is one that cannot be called Reform or Orthodox. Even though, as I said, he sees Torah and mitzvot as a real central feature of what it means to be Jewish. That both Reform and Orthodoxy are in many ways modern, and both lack a fundamental authenticity at times that Jewish life has long had. And we'll unpack a little bit how he sees even Orthodoxy as being very modern in ways that are, for him, somewhat problematic. To better understand how Rosenzweig envisions about what it means to be a Baal Teshuvah, we're going to look at some excerpts from two essays that he wrote, 1920 or so, that relate to his approach to Jewish learning. Because part of the conclusion that he comes to is the only way to return to Judaism is through learning. But it's interesting because to us, that kind of sounds obvious, right? If you want to return to Judaism, of course you should start with Jewish learning. All Jewish outreach today is prefaced on the idea that anybody's going to return to Judaism, it's through learning. But for Rosenzweig, this conclusion was somewhat radical, because as we know, Judaism cannot be reduced solely to learning, right? There are all these major components to how we think about Judaism. And in fact, in the essay we'll look at, Rosenzweig identifies three key components to Jewish life: the home, the synagogue, and halacha, and Jewish law. Those he sees as the three major components of Jewish life. Now, obviously, learning is sort of the umbrella that holds those together, but one could easily argue that a return to the Jewish tradition should start by focusing on the Jewish home, right? Start with kashrus, or start with, bringing Judaism into the home. Or maybe it should start with halacha, right? Picking a mitzvot that one is going to start to observe. Or maybe you should start by going to shul more, right? Don't go 3 times a year. Go every Shabbos, go to minyan, right? There's many ways in which we can conceive the return to Judaism, to the Jewish tradition, but Rosenzweig focuses on learning because he recognizes that these three components, the home, halacha, and the synagogue, are all somewhat lacking in ways that are problematic. And that what he comes to recognize is that, yes, we still need those three components, but the only way to even begin to connect to them or reinvigorate them is going to be through the experience, and really even this open-ended process of learning. So this particular essay, it's written to Edward Strauss, who's a friend of his. It's a really interesting essay, and what it contains is Rosenzweig's diagnosis of the modern Jewish condition and the problems of the modern Jewish condition. And as I mentioned, right, he sees that there are these three components of Jewish life: that emancipation, that modernity fundamentally shattered. And those three components, as I said, are the Jewish home, halacha, Jewish law, and the synagogue. And they were all sort of an organic harmony, a unity, and modernity kind of broke them all apart and didn't allow them to be what they were once before. Now, on a certain sense, you might say, well, wait a second. If you're imagining Reform versus Orthodoxy, it's very clear from the get-go that Reform gets rid of two of these, right? Reform basically eliminates the Judaism of the home, and it eliminates Jewish law. And what Reform is left with is the synagogue, right? That's it. And even the synagogue experience for Reform is very limited. Most Reform Jews only go to shul maybe 3 times a year at most, right? So it's easy to say Reform has lost its connection to the tradition because it's clearly lost its connection to most of those things. But to say that Orthodoxy has lost its connection to those three as well is pretty significant. And we'll have to understand how Rosenzweig sees the challenges of it. In a certain sense, in Rosenzweig's ideal world, Orthodoxy is closer to where he thinks Judaism should be, but Orthodoxy is not without its significant problems. So the excerpt from this letter, he says, life, a void unfilled for over a century, emancipated Jewry lacks a platform of Jewish life upon which the present can come into its own. For Jewish life to have a weight of gravity to it, a center of gravity to it, to have a vitality, the space that it can allow a Jewish life to flourish, it doesn't exist right now for emancipated Jews in Germany. Up to the time of emancipation, such a platform was provided by existence within the bounds of the old Jewish law and in the Jewish home and synagogal service, right? Those three are the three that tie Jewish life together. Emancipation shattered this platform. True, all three parts exist still, but because they're now only parts, they are no longer what they were when they were joined together. The single platform of a real and contemporaneously lived life, which learning and education had but to serve and from which they drew their greatest strength. Meaning previously, these three were like a unit and education just kind of helped sustain it and feed off of it. Now they're broken apart and education is almost like has to do all the work. And it's not, equipped to do that. An education alone can't make a person a Jew. It needs these other living pieces as well. There's actually a verse in Kohelet, right? A threefold knot will not quickly be torn asunder, right? So this idea of three that's holding together as one is certainly a Jewish idea. We even have this in the shul, in Cedar Sinai Synagogue. We have it written on our remembrance boards. This pasuk, because this idea of three shuls becoming one, that the threefold knot cannot easily be broken. And I think Rosenzweig's identification of these three components, home, halacha, synagogue, is pretty sharp. Like it captures, I think, the three major aspects that serve as the beating heart of Jewish life and how they combine together to make Judaism feel real and meaningful. You need all three. If all you have is one, it's not enough. For example, if all you have is the home, the Jewish home that's authentically Jewish, you have a Jewish soul, but your Jewish life is still bifurcated because your life is spent outside of the home as well. So having just a Jewish home is not good enough. It's also not really possible, right? We know today, if you're going to have of these three, very few if anybody has a authentically Jewish home, but nothing else. If all you have is halacha, Jewish law, then you have a Judaism in which you can take everywhere because that's the way halacha works. Halacha brings God into your life wherever you go, the norms, the commandments, the mitzvot, right? It's with you everywhere and it guides and its presence is there everywhere. But if all you have is halacha, then your Judaism lacks a soul, right? Because you cannot limit Judaism just to a collection of norms or behaviors. It lacks a home, right? It lacks a synagogue. And again, these are the things that enable Judaism to be something that you can share and live with others. And then the third component, if all you have is a synagogue, you connect with the Jewish community because that's what a synagogue offers, right? A Beit Knesset is a place where Jews gather. That's what the name literally means. So you do connect with others, which is very important, but it's a Jewishness that is limited only to the physical space of the synagogue. And it's only for a handful of hours a week, if you're lucky, if you go to shul every week. And that's not really enough, right? You need all three of these components organically connected to fill a Jewish life completely. And as I said, if you look at Reform, it limits itself only to the synagogues. That's clearly not good enough. But Orthodoxy too is not without its problems because it also, can't really fully connect all these three as much as it might want. And Rosenzweig goes on here to describe why exactly that's the case. So in terms of halacha, in terms of law, he notes that there are Jews in Germany that keep halacha, right? They're called what we call neo-Orthodoxy, or Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch. There are Orthodox Jews in Germany, but there are what we might call modern Orthodox. They're not sort of the same as the Eastern European Jews that Rosenzweig encountered, right? It's the difference sort of between modern Orthodox Jews and yeshivish ultra Orthodox Jews. That's the difference between the Orthodox Jews of Germany and the Jews of Eastern Europe. And what Rosenzweig notes is as follows. He says, wherever the law is kept amongst Western Jewry, amongst what we might say modern Orthodox Jews, It is no longer a living Jewishness, one that, while largely based on legal paragraphs, was taken naturally as a matter of course. This sort of Judaism has acquired a polemical point, meaning modern Orthodoxy, that, quite contrary to any original intent, is turned not against the outsider, but mainly the large majority of those within Jewry who no longer keep the law. Today, the law brings out more conspicuously the difference between Jew and Jew than between Jew and Gentile. So what Rosenzweig is criticizing here is that for Orthodoxy and modernity, halacha has become ideological and polemical and political. Halacha is no longer simply the word used to describe the ways in which Jews live their lives, right? Halacha instead becomes this term that is used to define Jewish practice in a very ideological, political way. Because issues that used to not be that halachically significant in the past suddenly become of great importance as a way of dividing between those who are Orthodox and those who are not, right? So if you know a little bit about the history of modern Jewry, issues like whether or not a synagogue can have an organ, issues about whether or not a synagogue has to have a mechitza. In halacha, these kinds of issues are rabbinic at most, but they became so polemical that Orthodox Jews said, no, these are, dividing lines. These are the most important thing. And in a sense, halacha sort of became a strong word, but like it changed because of these kinds of approaches, not because it was what halacha naturally was, but because of these becoming political battles. And we know this all the time, right? There are many things that might be theoretically halachically permitted, but they get prohibited because of cultural and political battles between, within Orthodoxy and defining who's Orthodox. Probably most famously, the Chatam Sofer in Hungary develops this idea based on a line from the Mishnah where he says, Chadash asur min Torah, right? That it's forbidden to make something new from the Torah. And this is again, just a profoundly ideological and read a page without recognizing that the rabbis, halacha, is flexible. Halacha changes. People think about halacha differently depending on the context. But Orthodoxy, to a certain extent, takes halacha and puts it in the freezer. It freezes it, and it takes certain issues and raises them to say that they are of great importance as a political issue. And that's why Rosenzweig says here, Orthodox Jews are more concerned about halacha being able to define who's Orthodox and who's not than anything else. And that's for Rosenzweig. If halacha is supposed to represent our relationship to God, and it does. Well, halacha is what mediates this covenantal relationship we have to God for Rosenzweig. The encounter with God, that we talked about this last week, is the experience of God's love. God's love is commanding. So to live a life according to halacha is to live a life in which one feels God's love in one way or another. And to turn halacha into this political game is to fundamentally almost take out this whole religious dimension of it. If halacha reflects our relationship to God, if it's what connects us to God, then how can it become this political ideological tool we use to separate one Jew from another? And we'll come back to Rosenzweig's approach to halacha in later shiurim because it's a very interesting and significant one. So that's halacha. That's how Orthodoxy is sort of kind of taken halacha away from its more traditional roots in ways that Rosenzweig finds problematic. Again, Reform has chucked halacha out the window, so that's obviously not an option either. The next component was the home, the Jewish home. As we talked about, for Reform, the Jewish home basically became German, very minimal Jewish presence within it. But at least Orthodoxy is trying to maintain the home as an authentically Jewish place. And here's how Rosenzweig describes it. He says, just as the law wrenched from its unity with home and worship is no longer what it once was, the two other planks of the platform are not what they used to be. And maintained intact is no longer the heart from which the bloodstream of all Jewish life is pumped and to which it returns. Slowly but surely, the home has lost its dominating position in Jewish existence. Life comes from outside and makes its own demands, right? The Jewish home isn't so authentically Jewish anymore, right? And we know this even in our own experience, right? American culture, pervades our home, right? You walk into a home in Beechwood or, University Heights, and yeah, if there's mezuzahs, you might know that they're Jewish. Yeah, if there's Sfarim, you might know that they're Jewish. But there's a lot of those homes that, even for people who are Orthodox, there's not a lot in which it differentiates it from, a typical American home. And that's the challenge, because fundamentally, to be modern Orthodox is to try to live in multiple worlds. And that's reflected in our home in ways that means our home doesn't always feel like totally Jewish in the way that a home should. Because if your home is like really the center point, the beating heart of your Jewishness, then it should feel Jewish through and through, not just have little scattered symbols of Judaism all over the place. He goes on to say the unity between home and occupation has been destroyed beyond hope, and even the strictest Jewish orthodoxy is forced to initiate its pupils into two different worlds of culture. Even German modern orthodoxy, right? The only way they can survive is to accommodate on some level to a modern German life, even as they're holding strictly to orthodoxy, but it means that Jews have to live in two worlds, which is very challenging, because at the very least, the Jew's going to get a profession, go become a doctor, go become a lawyer. They're going to interact with the non-Jewish world, and they're going to be, to a certain extent, part of that world, because they're a German too, and they identify as a German. And this creates a certain schizophrenia that's very hard for Jewish life when you're split between worlds. He goes on, he says, and thus the home has become at best but one thing in life, with another thing by the side of it and outside of it. The other thing, one's occupation, one's public activity, is no longer the natural radiation of the home into the outside world. It obeys its requirements and laws of its own. The home no longer binds Jewish life into a unity. Meaning, it used to be that, like, to be a Jew professionally was in some sense connected to your Jewishness. Even if your profession, nothing to do, you don't have to be a rabbi, but like, a Jewish, a tailor was like Jewish in a way that a modern Orthodox German Jewish doctor is not Jewish in being a doctor. When they're a doctor, they're German, right? Like when you're a doctor in America, you're American, right? And that's just part of the split that you make. Your Judaism kind of gets left at the door, so to speak. And that's probably a good thing in a lot of ways. But again, what it creates is this bifurcation, this split, this schizophrenia that makes Jewish life hard and much more fragmented. And just to give you a sense, Rosenzweig has one of these, it's a great line that he writes to his parents in one of his letters about the primacy of the Jewish home for Jewish identity. He says, this is what he says to his parents. He says, if we had kept a kosher kitchen, I would have been able to give up my educational plan. Meaning I wouldn't have had, if you had raised me with a kosher kitchen growing up, I would not have had to spend all my time as an adult trying to come up with these big, grand plans of Jewish education to help people return to Judaism. This educational plan that he initially developed, it was called It Is Time. However, in the given situation, when love is not dependent on the stomach, it needs to be expressed through the way of the spirit. Meaning, mommy and daddy, if you had fed me kugel and kept a kosher kitchen, my Jewish identity would be something tied up with my, those kinds of experiences that are very deep and very primal to who we are. Food is very primal to who we are. And I wouldn't have to spend all this time later on Jewish education, right? Because it would just be more like in my blood, so to speak. And there's something a little facetious here, but there's also something very true here, that the Jewishness that one imbibes in the home, if it's real and if it's present, is something that's very, very deep. And it's something that really leaves a mark on who we are as people. Like I know for myself, right? There are certain halachot or mitzvot that I only took on as I got older, but it's the stuff that I did when I was a kid in home that like sticks with me in a deeper way, and in certain sense, than some of the stuff I took on when I was later. Right? There's things that you do when you're young. There are things that you learn from your parents that if they are authentically Jewish, there's just something about it that like it stays in you. Chazal actually have this line. They say that the Torah that you learn when you're young, when you're a child, is like absorbed into your blood. Right? That's essentially what Rosenzweig is saying here. The food, if you eat, if it's Jewish, it's like absorbed into you and it stays with you. It's in your kishkas. That's what he's essentially saying here. But because I didn't get Judaism in my kishkas, then like I have to pursue it through education. There's no other alternative. And then the third component is the synagogue. And finally, there is the synagogue. And thence, at least, the stream of Jewish life still seems to flow. And though it is pitifully thin, it does trickle through the modern Jew, even if it does not wash over and around him. The most assimilated assimilationist does, as a rule, still take some part in its life, be it for an hour's memorial service or for his marriage, or at least for his funeral. Even the most assimilated Jew, they still show up to shul, maybe at least for Yizkor, maybe once or twice, or they're probably still married by a rabbi, or at least they're hopefully buried by a rabbi. They have a Jewish funeral. So even the most assimilated Jew still has certain touch points where the synagogue, where they enter into the synagogue. But for the same reason that the Jewish home and halacha cannot become what they once were, the synagogue cannot become what it once was for our collective existence, right? Yes, the synagogue is still there, and yes, even Reform holds on to it, but it's very difficult to get the synagogue back to what it was supposed to be for Jewish life. For the synagogue no longer acts as a member completing the body of a living life, right? So what he's trying to get at here is, particularly in Germany, right? Synagogues become church. It's that thing you go to for 2 hours a week for like a service, like a literal service, like theater. It's not something that you participate in as a community, as part of a community, as part of a living way of life, right? It's a performance you go to with others, and you have some sort of shared experience, but that's it. It doesn't press upon the rest of your life, the synagogue. Now, it's funny because the examples that he gives here about the way a synagogue is supposed to be are things that we still find in a synagogue. Orthodox synagogue. And it's things that I think about still with Cedar Sinai Synagogue. So it says, what is the way the synagogue is supposed to be? What is the way the synagogue is supposed to press into our lives to not just be limited to the walls of the shul? He says, well, for the synagogue, at least in Germany, no longer acts as a member completing the body of a living life. The beadle no longer knocks at house doors to summon us to shul. The beadle is a term for the shamash, the guy doesn't knock on people's homes to help try to get a minyan, right? The synagogue no longer does that. And that's a fascinating example, because what Rosenzweig is saying is that's a way in which the synagogue presses into our life, right? Synagogue's not just the theater I show up to. The synagogue can come knocking on my door. And part of the reason I love that is there were times I did that as a rabbi. On Shabbat, if we needed like a tent for mincha, I might have to, if for some reason Mitchell wasn't there, I would have to walk over to somebody else's house and knock on doors. Or certainly during the week, I'd have to make calls to get a minyan, right? There's something about the synagogue is supposed to reach out into our lives and not just be something that we show up at and experience for an hour or two, and that's it. He continues, he says, how many synagogues still have a study room with heavy folios of the Talmud and its commentaries right next to the room of worship, right? Most shuls, they have a library. They don't have a place where traditional Jewish texts are studied, where Gemara is learned, right? Where people come and they sit and learn Jewish texts together. And again, part of why I love this example is at our shul, right, in the little chapel next to the main sanctuary, right? That's where we have a full set of the Talmud, right? That's where people learn, right? If you go in there, at least before Corona, right, there would be people, after Shacharit who would study together. They would have like a mini chabura and learn together. That's what a synagogue is supposed to be, a place of life, a place of learning, not a place of theater and a place of performance. The synagogue has become quite in keeping with the spirit of the culture, obsessed, pigeonholing 19th century, a place of religious edification, right? It's a place that you go to feel like you can have a certain experience. That's the way it's become, but it's not a living communal experience, which is what it's supposed to be. All right, and that's the challenge with the synagogue. How do you recover that? Right? How do you make the synagogue this living place that presses upon you when you're not there? And that what goes on there isn't just a service, but like a living Jewish experience, learning, all sorts of stuff. Now, as I said, Rosenzweig identifies these three components, finds them all lacking, which means that it's not so easy to become a religious Jew, to really return to Judaism in his time. And what he goes on to say, and this is very, very significant, is that what bothers him about modern Judaism, Orthodox, Reform, or even Zionism, is the way that they are all so ideological. They all prescribe a certain set of rules and principles, and that's what you have to subscribe to, accept, in order to become a good Jew. So he describes it as follows here. He says, all recipes, whether Zionist, Orthodox, or liberal, produce caricatures of men that become more ridiculous the more closely the recipes are followed, right? So the metaphor here is significant. A recipe tells you how to make something. A recipe gives very defined amounts for the ingredients. And then a recipe goes through and tells you the steps about how to make something. When Judaism becomes reduced to recipes, to these ideological recipes that you have to subscribe to, then Judaism has become this deadening thing. It's actually very, very problematic. And what he points out is if you try to hold to the recipes, the more ridiculous you are, right? The most ridiculous Reform Jew is the Reform Jew who is like the most reform about everything, right? The most ridiculous Orthodox Jew is the one who is most ideologically Orthodox about everything, right? That's when Judaism becomes fundamentally problematic. And he says here, you become a caricature, right? You become like two-dimensional. Like there's something very wrong with your Jewishness when it gets reduced to these sort of ideological forms. And he says, and a caricature of a man is also a caricature of a Jew. There is one recipe that can make a person Jewish. That recipe is to have no recipe, as I've tried to show, and I feel rather inadequate words. So he's saying here something is open and you can make it whatever you want. He is not saying that. He believes very explicitly that Judaism, again, revolves around Torah and mitzvot and halacha and Jewish home and the synagogue and all of those things. But it cannot be prescribed and defined with clear definitions that one merely has to adhere to and accept in order to be Jewish. Any attempt to do that is deeply, deeply problematic. And Rosenzweig's whole point is that modernity, the modern Jewish experience, forces Jews to do that as a way of maintaining their Judaism, that we create these recipes for Judaism that are fundamentally anti-Jewish on a certain level. And that's really problematic. There are no recipes to be Jewish, no recipes to be Orthodox, right? A relationship to God, a relationship to Torah, a relationship to the Jewish people, they're bigger than that. And we know that. Like, again, I was an Orthodox rabbi. People come to me all the time with halachic questions. It is never one size fits all. And again, I'll keep touting our shul here because I think there's something about it that's very, very much in the spirit of Rosenzweig, right? We were an Orthodox shul, but we always saw ourselves as a shul for all Jews, right? You could drive there, you could walk there, right? There was no tzitzis check when you walk in the door, right? If we were a shul that was really ideological, right, we would basically say, this is what you have to, we'd have a little picture on the door about what a Cedar Sinai synagogue Jew has to look like. And we would check everybody who comes in. And if they didn't match that picture, they wouldn't be allowed in the door. Now, the irony is, as we all know, is that there's a lot of shuls like that. There's a lot of shuls even in Cleveland like that. They present a very clear ideological picture as to what a Jew is supposed to be. And everybody who's in the synagogue, comes because they fit that picture. They look like what that's supposed to be. Rosenzweig's point is that is not the way Judaism is supposed to work. And we have to somehow envision a return to Judaism that allows for people to pursue a Jewishness that's not a recipe, that's not an ideology, that's not a narrow political way of thinking, that reduces Judaism from being this, transcendent experience. Rosenzweig goes on in one of his essays to again emphasize this idea that Judaism cannot be a recipe, or as he describes it here, Judaism does not have dogmatics. I'll read what he says. I think it's worth just going through with it, and then I'll explain it. This is from a little bit of a later essay from 1923. He says, it has often been said and even more often repeated that Judaism has no dogmas. Right? One of the classic ways Judaism is often distinguished from Christianity, Christianity is a religion of belief. You have to believe certain principles. That's what makes you Christian. Judaism is a religion of action. You have to do certain things, and that's what makes you Jewish. But Judaism has no necessary beliefs. There's no fundamental principles of faith one has to affirm in order to be Jewish. Now, Rosenzweig points out that's the way it's often conceived and talked about. But here's how he qualifies it. He says, as little as that may be correct, a superficial glance at Jewish history or into the Jewish prayer book already teaches us the opposite. There's something true about the statement that Judaism doesn't have dogmas, but at the same time, Judaism has core beliefs. As he points out, look in the prayer book. The prayer talks about people, it talks about Brit, it talks about Geula, redemption, right? Obviously, there are principles without which Judaism can't exist. But what makes Judaism different from, let's say, Christianity is it doesn't have what he would say is dogmatics. Namely, Judaism has dogmas, but not dogmatics. We have principles, we have halacha, but there's no final word on what all that means. He goes on, he says, this means that the community Judaism does not wish to be, wants rather to be what it actually is, in contrast to other communities connected by spirit/intellect alone, a natural community of people, right? To become a Christian, particularly in Protestant Christianity, it's something you have to choose. It's something you have to affirm. It's something you have to believe. You have to be born again, right? To be a Christian, and even in Catholicism, means you have to subscribe to certain beliefs. And it's those beliefs, that faith in Jesus or whatever those set of beliefs are, that make one Christian. Judaism, again, you don't become a Jew because you believe certain things. You become a Jew for the most part because you're born Jewish. And it doesn't matter whether you believe anything, right? Elsewhere, Rosenzweig talks about Judaism being a blood community, in the sense that Judaism is so not dependent on belief that it gets passed down no matter what, right? It's a totally different way of thinking about what it means to be Jewish as opposed to what it means to be Christian. He says in the latter, the Christian church, the constant reformulating of Christological dogma again and again becomes the inner condition for the external continuation of the trying to write up dogma. What are the proper beliefs a Christian must have? That's what Christianity has done for most of the last 2,000 years, keeps doing it over and over and over again. And when Christians fight with other Christians, they're fighting about beliefs, right? When Jews fight with Jews, it's about much more stupid stuff. It's about like, what's the menu for Kiddush, or how high the mechitza should be? Christians, it's about beliefs. And that's very, very significant for Rosenzweig, because at the end of the day, there are core principles that practices, but there's no final word on what Judaism is or what it can be. And I'll just give you one example of this where it comes out of other kinds of Jewish thinkers. The Meshiloach, the Ishbitzer Rebbe, Hasidic Rebbe in Poland in the 19th century, and he points out that the very first of the Ten Commandments, right, is that we're supposed to believe in God. God took us out of Egypt. And the second of the Ten Commandments is that you can't make any idols of God. And that's very significant for the Ishbitzer Rebbe, because what he says is, what we learn from this is that whatever we think we know of God, even though God took us out of Egypt, even though God revealed the Torah to us, whatever we know of God, we only know part. We never know the whole. It's always something partial. And that idea that we as a people in relationship with God, that our Jewishness is never fully defined. It's always constantly unfolding, just as the Torah's meaning is constantly unfolding. We can't escape this. There's no final word to God. There's no final word to Torah. There's no final word to what it means to be a Jew. And in Kabbalah, those three are one and the same. Literally says in the Zohar, Kudsha brichu v'oraitu v'Yisrael chadu. Those three are one, right? And if there's no final word to God, there's no final word to Torah, there's no final word to the Jewish people. So when Orthodox or Reform want to argue there's a final word about what it means to be Jewish, they're essentially making an idol out of Judaism, just as it would be the same to make an idol out of God in that fashion. And Rosenzweig is so committed to a non-ideological Judaism, but a Judaism that's still committed, as I said, to Torah and mitzvot. He says something very interesting. This is in a journal from much earlier, from 1914. This is before he's even become halachically observant or anything like that, which takes several more years. He says, even if I was to live according to halacha, it would not prove that I am Orthodox in the deep meaning of the word. I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't keep halacha because of any other recognition than from this, I am a Jew now. That's very fascinating, right? For him, halacha is not going to be because I'm Orthodox, and that's what the Orthodox people do, and I have to keep a certain level of kashrut because my neighbor won't eat in my home if I don't keep chalav Yisrael, right? That's not the way he conceives of halacha. It's the way most people conceive of halacha. Halacha is like sort of a form of social pressure. I got to do what everybody else is doing. Rosenzweig says halacha is going to be because it's a natural extension of his Jewishness. Just like that Jewish child that he met in Bulgaria, their Jewishness, there was a natural extension of who they are. That's what halacha has to be. Just like Queen Victoria could sit down without looking if there's a chair there, that's what halacha has to be. It's not because other people tell me to do this or other people define it as this is the most important thing you must do. It's because it naturally flows from who one is as a Jew. It doesn't mean you get to throw out parts of halacha either. And we'll see later on how Rosenzweig navigates that. But halacha isn't something that I do simply because that's what the community tells me to do, because that's how they draw their lines about who's in and who's out. So Rosenzweig has an understanding. He's going to return to Judaism. He may even look Orthodox, but he's not going to be Orthodox in the way that people typically understand that word. The last thing we'll look at before we wrap up then is, where does this take us? As I said, Rosenzweig sees Jewish life as fragmented. It lacks a vitality in Germany. So then what do you do? If you can't return to the Jewish home, you can't make the home Jewish again, not so easily. If you can't suddenly just bring halacha back and make it fully present in one's life, and if the synagogue isn't such a great place to go and feel Jewishly connected, then where do you go? What do you do? And that's where he turns to learning. Learning is going to be the pathway that is going to reinvigorate a connection to the Jewish home, a connection to halacha, and a connection to this, and reinvigorate the synagogue. And that's the only way we can. That's the only path we can follow to find our way back to the tradition. Now, what's a challenge, as Rosenzweig is going to note here, is that Talmud Torah, learning Torah is also not so simple in modernity, because learning Torah works best when it is organically connected to life, when there's a natural connection between what you learn and what you do. And when those two things become disconnected, learning becomes much more complicated. So here's how he describes it. He says, this is actually part of the lecture that he gives when he opens the Lehrhaus. 1920, Rosenzweig opens what's in Frankfurt, what's called the Lehrhaus. It's basically an open Beit Midrash where Jews of all denominations can come and learn Torah together. It's a fascinating place. It actually does bring Jews who are Orthodox and Jews who are not Orthodox together, which is fascinating. This was 100 years ago that they did this in Germany, much because of the open spirit of the place. Like the main lesson was come and learn together, come and learn out of your curiosity, your desire to connect to the tradition, and come and learn and find a way back. Right, that was the clarion call. We'll go into that more next week, but that's the basic framing of it. And Rosenzweig gives a very interesting lecture when they launched the Lehrhaus in 1920. And what he's focusing on here is, if the only way to return to Judaism is through learning, because the other three components don't work, then what is that learning going to look like? Because learning is also not so simple when you're a modern Jew in Germany or a modern Jew in America or wherever. He says it is to the book that we owe our survival, right? We know this. Jews have survived because of the Torah, our connection to the Torah, our Torah study. That is what sustains us. That book, which we use not by accident in the very form in which it has existed for millennia. It is the only book of antiquity that is still in living use as a scroll. The learning of the book became an affair of the people, filling the bounds of Jewish life completely. Everything was really within this learning of the book. Right, we study Torah, and not only do we study Torah, but we study Torah as the center point of the Jewish prayer experience on Shabbat, right? Kriyat Torah, and we study Torah from the same type of scroll that our ancestors studied Torah from. That's how centered it is. We put it at the center of the most important Jewish communal experience, and we do it just like our ancestors did, right? As a way of showing just how central it is to us. And Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, right, the great rabbi, great Jewish thinker in America, modern Orthodox thinker. Right, he talks about how Kriyat Torah, the reading of the Torah on Shabbat, is a reenactment of Har Sinai. It's a revelatory experience. Har Sinai, the moment when the Torah was given, that's when the covenant was enacted between God and the Jewish people. That is what we recreate when we read Torah, especially on Shabbat, right? That covenantal, profound, revelatory experience. And that's what sustains us. He goes on, however, Rosenzweig, then came the emancipation. At one blow, it vastly enlarged the intellectual horizons of thought, and soon very afterwards of the actual living, right? With emancipation, Jews suddenly don't just have Torah, right? They have all these different intellectual worlds, right? Germany and Russian and philosophy and art and culture, right? Suddenly the Jewish world went like this to being dramatically expanded, the Jewish intellectual world. Jewish studying or learning has not been able to keep pace with this rapid expansion. Right? How does Torah study compete with university? How does Torah study compete with the art museum? How does Torah study compete with all these dramatic dimensions of culture, right, and intellectual possibilities, different religions, right, different nationalities, right, all these things, right? Like Torah was that which sustained the Jewish people, and suddenly Torah is competing with all these other profound possibilities, and that's a challenge for us. How can Torah keep up? That's the real question that he's dealing with here. He says, what is new is not that the Jews' feet could now take him farther than ever before. It's not that we get to leave the ghetto, he says. In the Middle Ages, the Jew was not an especially sedentary, but rather a comparatively mobile element of medieval society. Even when Jews lived in the ghetto, they could leave the ghetto and they could experience the broader world. However, when the Jews lived in the ghetto, they always returned to the ghetto at the end of the day. Like that was their world at the end of the day. Even though they could leave it, they always came back to it. For the modern Jew, we don't live in a ghetto, right? So the Torah, where it could fill the ghetto, and that was our life, once we leave the ghetto, the Torah has to somehow fill our world. And that's a much, much harder thing to do. Like I said, when we go to university, when there's modern science, when there's culture, like suddenly Torah has to hold all that together. And that's a very, very tall order for it to do. He says, the old style of learning is helpless before this spiritual immigration. In vain have both orthodoxy and liberalism tried to expand into and fill the new domains. But the problem is, how does Torah expand to fill this broad, brave new world that modern Jews are suddenly experiencing? It's not so simple, right? Not so simple at all. No matter how much Jewish law stretched, it lacked the power to encompass and assimilate the life of the intellect and the spirit. The mezuzah may have still greeted one at the door, but the bookcase had at best a single Jewish corner. Saying even for the Orthodox, it's hard to stretch Torah wide enough to hold your whole world together, right? And that's a challenge. And liberalism fared no better. Even though it availed itself by engaging in direct hand-to-hand combat with the law, it got rid of halacha, there was nothing to be done apparently except dilute the spirit of Judaism or pass for it as much as possible. The way that Reform solved the problem of Torah trying to be stretched to fill the world was basically to rewrite Torah. We'll just make Torah what the German culture is. And once we do that, we've solved the problem of the disconnect between Torah and the broader world. For the Orthodox, they try to stretch it, and it's hard to stretch it. It just can't go that far. And that's a problem. For the Reform, they just rewrite Torah. And that's what he says here. He says, it is impossible, he's criticizing Reform here, to assimilate to Judaism a field of intellectual and spiritual life through constantly reiterating a catchword and then claiming it to have a kinship with some Jewish concept or other. You see this all the time. Even in modern Orthodoxy, you see this. We can reduce Torah to modern ideas, and we just say there is a one-to-one correlation. That's how we solve the problem. The problems have been emphasized merely by referring to the sentence in the Torah that there's one law and one ordinance shall be both for you, the stranger that sojourneth with you. And neither those of socialism by citing certain social institutions or social programs in ancient Israel. You can't just take a pasuk, a verse from the Torah, and use it to say, okay, we're really modern because this verse just describes modern democracy, or this verse this modern social justice, right? Which was the Reform approach. We just have to rewrite Torah to fit life. And they do that by cutting out most of it and just taking a full. So this is a real challenge. Rosenzweig ends here. He says, learning the old form of maintaining the relationship between life and the book has failed. There has to be a connection between Torah and life, but how do we do that when life has gotten seemingly so much bigger than Torah? So much bigger than Torah. And that's the challenge that he's struggling with here. So I'm going to end with that. And I want to just summarize. I know we sort of are leaving ourselves a little bit with a cliffhanger. What comes next? We will pick up on that next week about how he envisions Torah study, Jewish learning in a way that's different than traditional Torah study, but it's a way but also not that different, in a way that allows one to return to the tradition. So just to summarize, for Rosenzweig, he recognizes that modernity has created a rupture from what Jewish life was to where it is right now. The question is, can we return to it? So sort of an authentic, holistic, organic Jewish lived experience, one in which Judaism is just who we are. He recognizes how challenging that is when the core components of Judaism, the Jewish home, halacha, the synagogue, have become fragmented, that they're not an organic whole, and that none of them really have the vitality that they're supposed to. The Jewish home isn't so Jewish. Halacha is awfully political a lot of the time. And the synagogue is not so much of it's really just like a show for a lot of people. If the only way then to return is through learning, how do we do that when our lives are so not Jewish? And Torah, like I said, is so disconnected from life. And keeping in mind that whatever the Judaism is we're striving towards, it's one that cannot be just prescribed by recipes. It can't be prescribed by ideologies. It can't be prescribed by a picture at the door of the synagogue that tells you like what a Jew is supposed to look like and be, right? It's much, much bigger than that. And the challenge is, how do we hold on to that open vision of Judaism while still being fully committed to Torah and mitzvot and a relationship with God and all of that? And that's the challenge that he's really going to try to take on in the shiurim ahead.